The Valley Politics History Interviews. I'm Terry Christensen. Mort Levine and his wife Elaine founded the Milpitas Post and other community-focused weekly newspapers, including the San Jose Sun, in the 1950s. Through their reporting and editorials, the Little San Jose Sun played a big part in shifting San Jose politics from the dominant pro-growth old guard to a whole new generation of leaders and policies. The Sun gave voice to neighborhood leaders and candidates like Janet Gray Hayes and Susie Wilson when the old Mercury News would not. The Levines also campaigned for planned growth and district council elections, again contradicting the old guard and the Mercury News. It's hard to imagine how the political changes of the 1970s could have occurred here without the Levines and the Sun newspapers. We aired our interview with Mort Levine in two parts in 2017. Now, here it is in full. Mort Levine, welcome to Valley Politics.
Thank you.
So you're kind of an expert on Valley politics. You and your wife Elaine arrived here in 1954 to found the Sun newspapers. You reported on the growth of San Jose and the Valley for those 25 years. The city grew from, it was 95,000 in 1950 before you got here. It was 650,000 by the time you closed down you sold the Sun newspapers.
Right.
So what brought you here? Why the Valley?
Well, it was clear to me when I was in the Navy in World War II that the West Coast was about to go wild in terms of growth, because all of the millions of people who came through here from the rest of the country always vowed they were going to come back here and live. Mm-hmm. And we had somehow gained a sense that when you spawned a subdivision of homes, you would spawn a shopping center, and that would spawn a newspaper. Mm. The concept is obviously oversimplified, but it's really what happened. There was a spurt of growth of the newspaper industry, which, in a sense, in that period, the 50s, was still the dominant medium.
Yes.
We began, actually, I came to work and worked as the editor of a paper in Los Altos before we started our first paper, which was in Milpitas in the end of 1954. And then shortly thereafter, a year or two later, we began plans for expanding into San Jose, and starting with the East San Jose Sun, and eventually had a ring around the center of San Jose, which had a center in those days, by the way. And it became a thriving enterprise because people genuinely wanted alternative to the rather fat and sassy Mercury of its day.
The Mercury and News were the daily
Mercury and
newspapers.
News were joined together at the hip because they were owned by the same people.
But back in those days, they had a morning Mercury and
an
an
morning Mercury and an evening News.
The Sun papers were weekly, right?
They were weekly, mostly toward the end of the week. Yeah. And then ultimately we had a couple that were twice and three times a week toward the end of our holdings there. And
what became of the Sun papers? When did they end and why?
Well, we sold the entire group, and at that time, in 1979, we had 78. We had 16 mastheads stretching from Palo Alto south to the southern border of San Jose, and including most of the West Valley cities, which had incorporated during that period. Mm-hmm. And the East Valley cities as well. There was really only the Milpitas, and so it provided as I say, an alternative to the Mercury. But the sale went to a very large magazine publisher that thought that suburban newspapers was a growth industry. They were right in one hand, but they didn't know how to run weeklies, and that had to have a more intimate connection with the people they wrote about. So they weren't very successful, and within a few years, they were spinning off some of the mastheads and ultimately sold that group to a bunch of
How did you
publishers.
do what they couldn't do? How did you make those connections to communities that made your Sun newspaper successful for
Well,
a couple of decades?
I think because we had a dedication to being as local as possible within the neighborhood areas that we covered, and at the same time defending these communities, because it was a time of rapacious development, and the residents of the communities were being badly treated and badly served by the Mercury, which was at that time in the hands of the development interests.
So the Mercury was rabidly pro-growth.
Absolutely.
The growth is a good thing.
Joe
right?
Ritter said something like, apricot trees don't read newspapers.
Yeah, they were referring to the orchards that had to
Yes.
be cut down to develop the housing. So did you really set out to be an alternative voice to the Mercury News, or did you kind of become
No,
that?
I think that was driven really by the factors on the ground.
Yeah.
I think we were happy to have developed a series, perhaps 4 or 5 papers, each of which had a strong enough local base that could survive on its own. And subsequently, that's what's proved to have happened, because the papers we owned at that time, like the Saratoga News, the Los Altos Town Crier,
Milpitas
Post, they're all able to survive as independent papers.
Let's talk about what politics in San Jose particularly. You had several newspapers in different parts of San Jose. What was the politics of the city like in the 50s into the 60s?
It was changing. It was changing rapidly. The development interests, you might, in a sense, say, got here first, because they were obviously greatly motivated, and of course there was no question that the taking of an unimproved piece of property, namely an orchard, and changing it into a shopping center or a subdivision, was the makings of great fortunes. And with that driving force, there was another gold rush. And all of the business interests in the community, not all quite, but many of them, bought into that mantra. But the residents who were starting to take hold and understand the mechanisms of power politically started very slowly, but through individuals. And this wasn't a partisan thing to start with, by the way. It was very nonpartisan. The League of Women Voters prided itself on not being partisan, and the Republicans were moderates in those days compared to today. But they grabbed you might say, the levers of power, and took them away from the developers. It was a battle, and it was bloody at times.
So the opponents to the developers were not so much opposed to growth per se, as opposed to the way San Jose was growing, which was without sufficient services. Schools, we talked at our last episode about Measure B in 1973,
right,
which required schools to sign off on any new housing to say they could absorb the students.
Right.
Or it was roads for transportation, or it was parks or libraries, police and fire
there was also
services.
environmental concerns.
Absolutely,
and traffic. And California was going, as a state, going through this tortuous process of trying to clean its air and get decent water and all that kind of thing was happening at the same time.
Yeah. Who were some of the early leaders in San Jose in bringing about that change? People you reported on in the Sun papers.
Yeah. Well, I think we also saw a feminine revolution at the same time. And women, there are a group of women who didn't work, contrary to today. And I don't like to use the phrase didn't work. We know they worked very hard. But these women were not committed to a full-time job, and they were married to professionals, doctors, lawyers, and others, and academics, and they began coming together and trying to figure out how things worked in San Jose. And San Jose had its earlier history had a lot to be ashamed of in terms of bribery and collusion with certain development interests and utility companies and various things that go back a long, long way.
The railroad, if we go back far enough.
The railroad, that's right. But certainly when we first came here, we met people who had actively fought those interests, like people I'm talking about, like Alden Campen. And Bob Dorr, who fought to get the water for the people of San Jose and were treated really close to violently. I
have to say Alden was one of my first mentors in local politics.
Mine too.
Great teacher.
And we would meet for lunch at
Not a professional teacher, but...
Right. Well, you would probably enjoy the fact that we would meet for lunch once a week, and he would bring me a book every time, a new book that he had read and he'd wanted to share.
Yeah.
And remarkable guy and symbolic in a way of the new thinking that was happening in San Jose. And he's inspired many of us of that era, and including the women who lived all around him in that center, that Willow Glen Rose Garden.
Rose Garden, yeah.
And Janet Ray Hayes came out of that and became the first woman mayor.
Elected to the council in 71 as part of changes on the council, and then mayor in 74. Right. And that was a watershed election.
It absolutely was. Well, both of her elections to the mayor were really significant because in each case she managed to beat down, in the case of Al Garza as councilman, the growth interest and the venal kinds of...
when she was reelected in 78, that was the year of the Gang of Four that tried to overthrow her, fire the city manager, and so on.
Right, that's exactly right. And then, of course, when she ran against Bart Collins...
That's her first election, 74.
The first election, that was the symbolic of the city government hand in glove with the pro-growth elements. And although Collins wasn't identified per se as a developer, that's how he thought. And that was a very tough election.
And that was the old Mercury News. They were very pro-Collins, very anti-Hayes, anti-controlling growth.
Absolutely. And so it wasn't until Joe Ritter, the publisher of the Ritter newspapers, and Knight Ritter newspapers, was moved out into an early retirement, that the Mercury News became a much more balanced paper in the growth fight.
Well, some people would still argue with that.
Well,
but you said much more balanced.
Yeah,
that's
of course, I know
true.
They didn't go all the way.
You know, the other event in the 70s that I think the Sun was so important for was the move from citywide elections of council to district elections of council, so neighborhood by neighborhood. And you know, your newspapers formed a core in just several parts of the city that helped develop the neighborhood identities that fed into the movement to district elections. It also involved Latinos on the east side, upset that they weren't being represented.
Sure.
Women were having a harder time getting elected. So there were a lot of elements to the coalition. But there were 118 neighborhood groups in 1978.
Wow, I had forgotten that.
Yeah, and the sun is part of what helped build them up and maintain them.
Well, I don't want to pretend that this was all sheer idealism. There was self-interest as well. Anything that strengthened the neighborhoods, we thought would strengthen neighborhood newspapers. And so we were glad to see the emergence of local leaders in these neighborhoods. I'm not sure we're looking back on it, we were 100% right, because sometimes you get democracy produces some funny things, and I'm not sure how the district elections has worked on a long term. I'll let the political scientists puzzle that one out.
Well, it certainly changed the way the city makes decisions and gave neighborhoods and districts of the city better representation. You know, we're 1 million people in San Jose now,
Yeah.
so citywide elections would be really tough.
There's no question it was farsighted in that view, in that regard, because clearly the city might have been unmanageable even at a couple of 100,000, but
Yeah.
it certainly would have grown to be totally unmanageable with a little clique of people living within 10 blocks of each other running the whole town.
So what's your advice to a young journalist today?
Well, I think we're living through a wonderful new era of enterprise journalism. And
Oh yeah, you don't need a printing press anymore.
You don't need a printing press. You need to have good legs and energy. But I think we're getting some of the best journalism we've had in decades now with the present national administration. And it's true, newspapers have changed.
Don't think Donald Trump would agree with that.
Well, the thing is that journalism, in a sense, was reborn after the Watergate era. Journalism schools exploded,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of energy in the concept of investigative reporting. I think we're seeing that again now after a long hiatus, and the internet is helping.
Well, Mort, that's a good optimistic note to end on. Thanks very much for talking with us today.
Well, we're happy that you came up.
For other interviews with the leaders and activists who shaped the history of San Jose and Santa Clara County, look for the Valley Politics History Interviews on YouTube. I'm Terry Christensen. Thanks for watching.